Hey everybody, welcome to this week's edition of Table Talk. I'm sitting here with Aaron and my name is Jason. And so to start off, we just want to know where you're watching us from. So be sure to put that in the comments and then share and like this with your friends. We like getting kind of deeper in what the Bible is teaching us. And so the way we usually start that is looking back. And so last week, what did we learn last week?
Well, thanks, Jason. Last week, we looked at the book of Acts in chapters 8 through 12, and we learned that Jesus' kingdom of peace and love is for all people and all nations. It wasn't just for the Jews, it was for everyone. And so then what we did was we asked you guys to share the gospel with some people that were different. And the question that we asked was, did sharing the gospel cause you doubt and fear or strengthen joy? And so if you got a chance to share the gospel with somebody last week, we want to know that back. Did it cause you doubt and fear, or did it give you strength and joy? And then what steps did you take to release yourself from prejudging others in order to share the gospel? If you remember, the challenge was to not prejudge before you share with them. There's a child of God, I'm going to share with them, and go ahead and just see what happens. And so as you did that, were you blessed even if they rejected the gospel? I don't know, Jason, if you've run into that, if you shared with people, even when they rejected the gospel, how did you feel afterwards?
Oftentimes I usually feel that second one, the fear and doubt, I guess. But then after praying about it, I was consistent with what Jesus called me to do, and I did it. And so in that, I find hope.
And that's usually what we find with people. We want to hear from you. If you got to share with somebody this past week, especially someone who maybe in the past you might have prejudged them, but you got the strength and the courage and were obedient to share with them, even if they rejected the gospel, how did you feel afterwards? And not really look beyond just the interaction that might have gone maybe even a little negative, but how did you feel afterwards about being obedient to Christ's command to share the good news? So please let us know about that. Share with that. You can do it in the comments, or just send us an email. Don't have to make it private. Send us an email. We want to know what's going on out there. So we're going to move on now.
Yep.
To the next video, and that's looking at the book of Acts, chapters 13 through 20. So let's go to the video.
During the first century, most people around the Mediterranean Sea lived in densely packed cities, all ruled by the Roman Empire.
Each city was a diverse blend of cultures, ethnicities, and religions.
And because of this, there were all sorts of temples for offering sacrifices to all sorts of gods, and each person had their own portfolio of gods that they gave their allegiance to.
But in every city, you would also find a minority group who wouldn't worship any gods but their own. The Israelites, also known as the Jews. They claimed that their God was the one true creator and king of the world.
Now, all these cities were connected by a network of roads built by the Roman Empire, and so it was easy to move around, to do business, and even spread new ideas.
Now, one person familiar with these roads was the Apostle Paul. He spent the second half of his life traveling from city to city, announcing that Israel's God had appointed a new king over the nations.
This king wasn't like anyone who'd come before.
Right. Most kings rule with aggression or power, but this new king rules with self-sacrifice and love. His name is Jesus, and Paul is his herald, who's inviting all people to live under this king's rule.
The stories of Paul's travels and how people received this message, that's what the third part of Acts is all about. For some time, Paul's home base had been in the city of Antioch. And from there, he and his co-workers went out on 3 road trips, traveling by land and by sea to strategic cities throughout the empire.
In each city, Paul's custom was to go first to the Jewish synagogue where his people gathered. He'd start teaching and showing how the Messianic king promised in the Hebrew scriptures is Jesus of Nazareth.
And some believed this news, others didn't, and still others thought this message was so misleading and dangerous, they would incite riots to kick Paul out of town.
And so that's when Paul would take to the bustling city marketplace. He would set up shop there to make and sell leather tents to cover his travel expenses. And here, Paul kept sharing the news about the risen King Jesus with anybody who would listen.
He was often misunderstood as just promoting a new god. One time he prayed for a sick person, they were healed, and everyone around thought he must be a Greek god that came down to visit them.
But Paul insisted there's only one true God, and he was his servant. This message often stirred up opposition and more riots, and he got beaten, even thrown in jail.
Why such a strong reaction?
Well, the worship of the gods held together Roman culture. They believed the gods kept their cities safe, and the temple worship of the gods was a huge part of their economy. Paul wasn't just adding Jesus as a new god to the list, he was saying all other gods are powerless, even a sham.
So he's undermining their way of life.
Yes, and more than that. When Paul announced Jesus as a new king, he would call him Lord or Son of God, the very titles people used to refer to the emperor of Rome.
So Paul's message could easily be heard as a threat against the entire political order. Why would anyone join this movement? I mean, it sounds dangerous.
Well, people were captivated by the story of Jesus and how his love created communities where all people were treated as equals, regardless of ethnicity, gender, or economic status. These people formed new families that would eat together. They lived sacrificially and took care of their poor.
They lived like Jesus actually was the king.
Right. And so in every city where Paul announced the message about Jesus, people were being transformed by God's Spirit to become new kinds of humans.
So Paul would stay in that city and teach them the way of Jesus.
And then he would leave for a new city.
This was a difficult life. Paul had to endure a lot of pain and a lot of suffering.
Yeah, and he did so because he believed that his own hardships were a reenactment of Jesus' suffering and death for others. He said it was God's own love that drove him to share the story of Jesus, no matter the cost.
After his third road trip, Paul's reputation had grown. He had made many new friends, but had also made many new enemies that he would be wise to avoid.
But Paul didn't avoid them. His next stop was Jerusalem, a city full of people who wanted him arrested, even dead. And so why he goes to Jerusalem and what happens when he gets there, that's what the final section of Acts is all about.
Okay, so in this video, our third video of the book of Acts, we're starting to concentrate on Paul's ministry and what he did. And we looked at what it was like for him to travel around announcing the good news about the risen Jesus. And we looked at what drove him to plant new Jesus communities in city after city and how people responded to his message. So, a couple questions I have for you, Jason, from the video, and talk about these if you're with somebody or in the comments section. But in what ways were the first century Middle Eastern cities under Roman rule similar to our cities today? How was the first century city similar to 21st century city here?
Well, I think let's just take the state of Texas. Like when you travel to the different major cities, each city has its own feel.
Okay.
And obviously in the city you have millions of people, mostly from different backgrounds. And so their ways of doing simple things like cooking and even how they talk, mixed with what they believe, religion, and mixed with maybe even backgrounds they come from, how a country was governed. It's all different. And so
right, you sort of put a multiple of those together, you start getting this sort of melting pot thing, like the USA, is kind of viewed as, but each city starts to look like that. They have a lot of different religious views, a lot of different economic views even. And that's how the cities were back then. And even like some of our cities today, people were encouraged to do their own thing.
yeah. Oh, definitely.
And so you look at that, it's a very similar thing today. Hey, you do you, I'll do me. Everybody will be okay, right? So every time Paul went to a new city, he got three basic responses, okay? He would share the gospel, he got three basic responses. What were they?
First one was they would accept.
Yeah, someone would accept, yay!
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what we want. I mean, that's great, but that doesn't happen all the time.
Right.
And then the second one is usually they listen, but they don't care one way or the other.
Right. They're like, okay.
I'm going to do whatever I want to do.
Yep.
And then the third one is the one that's always the scariest, is like not just rejection, but you just shared that with me, and now I have angst towards you.
Right.
And so
People got angry, people got mad, okay? They even wanted to kill him.
yeah.
In some places, okay? So and Paul suffered for that, okay? So why did Paul rejoice in his suffering for the sake of the gospel, though? He writes multiple times that he rejoiced, and if you look at his letters later on, he rejoices in his suffering. Why would he rejoice in suffering?
Well, he was always comparing himself to that one person that we're supposed to compare ourselves against, and that's Jesus Christ. And so when God would think, when Paul would think of what Jesus did while he was on earth and the suffering he went through so that we could have the free gift of eternal life that none of us deserved, he would often literally put himself in Jesus's shoes, which I'm assuming were sandals or no shoes at that point, but and think about what Jesus went through. And because of that, he was able to endure that. Not only did he just endure it and make it through those times of being beat, being imprisoned and that sort, he started to enjoy it and thrive off of it in such a way that's like, okay, I'm doing the will of God and I'm going to keep going.
He actually felt it bringing him closer to Jesus, being able to empathize with him even more within that. Now, we need to watch this word suffering. It's not just suffering, okay, that he's saying here that he can be radical. It's suffering for the sake of the gospel.
Right.
It's suffering for the sake of bringing people the truth. So when Paul sees himself in that situation, he sees himself as coming closer to Jesus and closer to God, suffering for the gospel.
And I want to hit on suffering really quick, especially since in the cities that we live in, it's oftentimes where we will draw attention to ourselves because we feel like we're suffering, but we're doing it out of pity and out of pride so that we can essentially try and get attention from other people to help where we're at. And so that is not the suffering we're talking about at all. Like suffering for the sake of Christ and because you're doing his will, not your own will. And so there's two different types of suffering there. So
yeah, it's almost like my boss is persecuting me. Was that because you're doing a bad job?
Right.
Or is it because you've been sharing the gospel?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So here's and looking forward, here's kind of the point. Many were captivated by Paul's message and formed Christian communities, transformed by God's Spirit, become new kinds of people. So many people did accept, and he was willing to go through those who didn't care. Well, we don't, but even those who would get angry and mad with him and want to hurt him, he would continue to do that for the sake of those who were still saying yes.
Yeah.
All right. So here's some questions for you. Here's some challenges for you. Have you or anyone you known suffered for the sake of the gospel? If you've suffered for the sake of the gospel or know of someone, we want to hear from you. In the comments section or send us an email. Share that with others. Share that story. And if you need help, there's a really good website I want you to go to, www.persecution.com. Go there. Voice of the Martyrs really has a really good program that can share, and we'll put it in the links below, persecution.com. So here's my other challenge. Are you part of a Jesus community that has been transformed by God's Spirit to share the good news? Are you part of a community? If you're part of the Feed the Need family, we want you to share the good news. But wherever you are in your family, church, whatever, are you transformed for the sake of sharing the good news? And if yes, will you go about doing it this week? Sometimes we have to be a little intentional.
Yeah.
About doing that. We actually have to maybe write a couple names down. And if you're looking for a couple names, just pull out the contacts list on your phone, okay? And write down a couple names. Begin praying for them. Prepare the soil for bringing that good news. And if you're not sure if you're prepared for that or not sure how to go about doing that, I want you to tune in next week and we're going to show you how you can share the good news of the gospel. So we want you to continue making a list of those who need to hear. The 3 circles, you can use that. We have that on our website, the link to that. And so you can find that there. And for next week, we want you to read chapters 21 through 28 of the book of Acts. So until then, Jason?
We will see you guys next week. And don't forget to share the gospel this week with somebody. Again, you have to be purposeful, because if we stand idle, we won't be doing what Jesus wants us to do. So we'll see you guys next week.
Amen. God bless.
This month, our core value is simplicity. The more we complicate ministry, the more we get in the way. Keep the heart of the ministry by feeding people physically and spiritually. As humans, we often try to overcomplicate things, but by keeping it simple, we can stay true to the vision that Jesus has given us.